Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Controller's Corner session. My name is Lonnie, and I am a business solutions consultant here at CR Group. We've designed a series of free webinars to help Dynamics users really take their GP to the next level and utilize some of the features and efficiencies that are available. And one of the more recent additions to GP in the last several versions is the introduction of approval workflows for various functions in Dynamics GP. Over the course of the last few releases, Microsoft has continued to add additional workflow capabilities. So today's session is dedicated to understanding how to build an appropriate workflow in GP and the functionality available within it. So with that said, a few housekeeping items before we get started. Today's presentation will be recorded and it will be available on demand later this week on the Controller's Corner webpage on the CR Group website. Also, I encourage you to ask questions, so please submit them in the GoToWebinar panel and I will do my best to get to them at the end of today's presentation. Finally, this session will count for a half hour of continuing professional development hours, and we will email an individual certificate to all attendees this week. In the session today, we are going to talk about the general administration configurations for workflows. We will then review all of the workflow types available in Dynamics GP. After that, we are going to talk about what you should be doing internally to properly design and map your workflows. And then we're going to jump into GP and show you how we can demonstrate how a workflow can be implemented and activated. And then I'll go to the workflow webinar panel for questions if required. The workflow functionality in GP has an integrated email component that has to be set up in GP. In order to use this tool, you need to have a web service installed, and you have to have an email account that email notifications can be sent from. So basically the setup window looks something like this. The information needed here can usually be configured by our team with the assistance of your IT team. In addition to email notifications being sent, you can also include what we call action buttons in the email that allow users to approve, reject, or delegate the approval direct from the email rather than having to log into GP to complete the process. So, and that functionality is available for, I believe, all of the different types of workflows available within GP. When you create a workflow, you are able to define the deadline for the approval to take place. However, you want to be able to ensure that the timelines provided are based on appropriate business hours. So if your business is open Monday through Friday from 8 to 5, you can set that up in your calendar as the work days available so that if an approval is sent on a Friday afternoon and you give 2 business days as the deadline, the system would then ignore Saturday and Sunday if it's not part of your normal working hours. And you can also set up statutory holidays for office closures by date so that those dates are also not included in the calculation of the due date of a task or approval process. So the one thing to keep in mind with that, though, is that you have to update that workflow calendar every year. And as you can see in the slide, there is a year drop down available. So that is so that different dates or different statutory holidays that fall in different dates a year, you can update annually so that in 2018, 2019, etc., they're falling on the correct dates. In Dynamics GP, email messages have been created for each of the workflow types, which includes some very general language and certain fields from the approval documents themselves. However, you do have the ability to modify any of these emails to use the language that is appropriate for your organization. And you can also add additional fields into the email that you would want included from the document. The benefit in including fields from the document really does allow approvers to see all of the necessary data in the email so that they can use the action buttons available to complete the approval rather than having to log in to the web client or GP in order to process the approval. If you would rather not modify the existing email, you also have the ability to create your own emails completely from scratch. to fit whatever other needs you may have for notification as it relates to your workflow process. One of the many great features in GP Workflow is the ability to attach documents to the approval and have those attachments flow through the email notifications. So if you are creating a purchase requisition and want to include quotes as part of the approval process, you can attach all of those quotes obtained, and those attachments will flow to the approver as part of the requisition. So they can see which type of, or which vendor you are selecting, especially if your procurement policy has to take the best price offered as part of its policy or process. Again, to use this functionality, there is a basic setup window to complete that outlines the default location of where those attachments will be stored and what options you want activated as it relates to the attachments, including if you want them to be included in notification emails, etc. So window looks like what you see on screen. It's not an overly complicated setup, but we can certainly assist you with that as well if you have questions about the setup of those workflow functionalities. So now that we've looked at the configuration of the general workflow functionality in Dynamics GP, now we can look at what workflow types are actually available. So within the workflow maintenance, each workflow type is organized by module, and you'll see there are various different types of workflows that fall under each of those modules. So today, during our demonstration, we're going to take a look at the purchase order approval workflow. But you can see through here that there are various different workflows available. Please make note that the payroll functionality is really isolated to the U.S. payroll component. So if you are using the payroll functionality here with GP, unfortunately these workflows I don't believe have yet been developed to include the Canadian payroll function. Before we show you how to implement and activate a workflow, it's really important to talk about how you should approach designing your workflow. So our team at CR Group can certainly assist with this by working through a detailed requirements review with you regarding your workflow needs. But you should start by asking yourselves some of the questions that you see here. And this will really help in understanding what your needs are and generate discussion internally to ensure that everyone is on the same page in the organization in terms of what your policies and processes are. So you can see there's a number of questions that should be answered, including things like who initiates the actual workflow, who participates, who's the approver, how many steps are there, what are those steps, etc. So these are things that you want to sit, you want to talk, you want to discuss, whether it's with various groups of people in some sort of committee format, or if it's really just sort of those high-level stakeholders that are involved in this process. It really does make the most sense to have some really good, strong internal discussions to ensure that you're really mapping this out correctly. And that's an important part of this because you want to make sure that your process is not going to sort of go outside of the limits of what GP workflow can do for you. So I will say that, every software has some limitations, and if your workflow is very, very complicated, it may not necessarily fit within the workflow functionality that exists in Dynamics GP as is. Once you've determined the answers to these questions and you've outlined your needs, it's time to map it out. So whiteboarding and creating some good diagrams to map out what you've discussed will help you to visualize the flow accordingly. So ensuring that all parties involved in designing the workflow process understand the individual steps and what order they happen in is very important. And these diagrams allow you to see, are there any pitfalls or contradictions that would need to be revisited prior to implementing the processes in GP themselves. And so this is really important because we'll want to make sure that the process is consistent across the board and that there aren't too many exceptions to the rule. One of the biggest problems we see with a lot of organizations is, well, it works like this, but there are times when it doesn't. And so automating the buts are very difficult in that too many exceptions to the rule make automating a process almost impossible. So we need to make sure we're designing the process for the bulk, the 90% of what's happening in the organization as it relates to this particular type of process, whatever that may be. So we're going to hopefully dive into GP and take a look at some of the key components in action. As I mentioned, I've been having some technical difficulties with my computer this morning, so hopefully we'll be able to get to that. But before we do that, what we want to talk about is what are the answers to the questions we have in terms of the demonstration. So based on the questions we saw in the earlier slide, here are some of the answers that I've populated as part of the workflow setup that I'm hoping I will be able to show you in today's demonstration. And I'm not going to go through all of the process of setting up all the steps, but rather just set up one or two to give you an idea of how it would work and how it gets developed in GP. So what you'll see here is we're looking at a purchase order approval. We've got, a procurement officer who initiates those POs. The approval process has a procurement officer and some approval managers that are involved in that. And we talk about how many steps are involved in the process. So because we're using department as a component for the driver, we have 5 departments within our organization, and we have 2 steps per department. So what that means is we have sort of 10 total steps that make up our workflow process. And as I said, I'm not going to set up all 10 steps with you today, but this is just to give you an idea of how we should be sort of mapping this out for ourselves. What are the conditions? What are the key steps in the process before we actually try and start designing it in GP? So here's the mapping of my workflow based on this. So I've created a diagram. The actual requisition goes to the procurement officer, and they create the purchase order. If it is greater than $1,000, it's getting routed to the department manager for approval. If it is not, they simply send the purchase order to the vendor. So there is no approval process for any purchase orders under $1,000. If the department manager approves, the next question in the process is the PO value greater than $10,000? And if so, then it goes to the next level of approval for that department. So the PO could be rejected at either of these levels. So the procurement officer cancels the PO in that case. If approved by all necessary parties, the procurement officer sends the PO to the vendor. So that's sort of our mapped out process in how it works in terms of what we want to create in GP. So from that perspective, sorry guys, unfortunately I just can't seem to get this going, and I don't want everybody to sit here and wait for me to play with my machine all day. So I will speak a little bit to the workflow maintenance and how the functionality and what types of functionality exists. So when you initially set up a workflow process within GP, you will have to assign at the front end of that process a manager. And what manager actually means within the workflow is that this person has almost administrative type of rights to that workflow, meaning that they have the ability to approve workflows sort of over top of the approver. So kind of giving them power user status over being able to action items within that workflow. So that is not necessarily something you want to assign to everyone, because then they can approve everybody's workflows, not just their own. This is somebody who sort of sits at the top end of this, that in somebody's absence or can be used as a delegate to sort of manage the workflow process. So keep that in mind when you're building this process. When we create a new workflow, there are a number of options that are available within the workflow. So, email notifications that get sent out upon completion of the workflow. Who would you want to receive those? So usually the person who has to send the PO to the approver, and in our case, if you look at my diagram here, that would be our procurement officer. So she would need to be notified that, or he, that has been approved, and that they can go ahead and send it to the vendor, or if it's been rejected, she also needs to be notified in order to cancel the PO. And you can CC other people on those notifications as well if needed. So that's something to keep in mind as well. You can actually allow approvers the action type, as I mentioned in a previous slide, to delegate tasks or approval to other people. So if you want the approver to have the delegate option available in the email, there is a checkbox within the workflow setup that you have to select in order to give them that action button. You can also give options to the originator of a purchase order to be able to approve it, and there is a checkbox for that. In this case, in our case here, looking at our diagram, our purchasing officer or procurement officer would not be the person to approve purchase orders. She is not a departmental manager of sorts, so in that case, I wouldn't want her to be able to approve transactions that she's creating in terms of work, in terms of POs. You can also indicate if you require at least one approver to participate in the process. And again, a checkbox is available for that. Because in this particular case, again, based on my diagram, any expenses over 1,000 require an approval, but anything below 1,000 does not. So I would leave that particular option unchecked in my case. And finally, there's a checkbox which we call alternate final approval option. This allows you to enter a specific name for an alternate final approver if you want to escalate the workflow to a different person. So this will usually be used if any of the following conditions are met. You always require at least one approver, and that checkbox is checked. And there are no approval steps whose conditions are met. So that's one. They always require at least one approval option is marked, and the approver edits the document, and there are no following approval steps. So if the person who is supposed to be approving it makes an edit to it, but there is no subsequent approver, it would automatically route to that final approver if you have that at least one approval option marked. And if there are no approval steps following an overdue step, depending on the escalation settings you set up, which we're going to look at, it would go to that final approver. Now, keep in mind that a final approver is workflow specific, not step specific. So it means that that alternate final approver is the same for all the steps in your workflow, okay? Below in your setup, you're going to be able to set up an escalation option when a task or approval is overdue. And that is, you can either take no action at all, just leave the PO sit there and wait for approval. You can escalate it to a next approver, and this will assign the approval to the next approver in the workflow process, or the alternate final approver if there isn't one. You can escalate it to a specific person, and again, workflow specific, it's not step specific, so everybody's would be routed to that specific person. Or you can automatically reject the task, and it gets sent back to the originator. So in our case, the procurement officer would get it back rejected, and they would have to then resubmit it for approval at that stage. So once you've created the workflow settings itself, you can start to add steps to your workflow. So in our case, we have some steps with some conditions associated to it. And you can have steps that are either an approval type, which means that a user must give an approval as part of the workflow process, or you can select a task type, which means the user must complete a procedure as part of the workflow process. Okay, so some cases, some people will have their accounting team take a look at the PO, make sure that the account being selected and things like that, or audit the document prior to approval is put in place. That's more of a task than an approval process. And then you can set up conditions for each of your steps. So our first step in our case would indicate that all purchase orders over $1,000 have to be approved by a department manager. So we need to select the option that says action is required only when the following condition is met. And you'll see there's a radio button when you look at your workflow setup that gives you that option. If a person had to approve all purchase orders with no specific conditions associated to it, then there's an option that says action is always required. required for this step, meaning that no matter what the condition of the PO is, this first step is always required. When we select conditions, we then need to identify the fields that are required to be used in the workflow process. So I know each department has to approve their own purchase orders. So there is actually a field available for line items called line item comment ID. So I would typically use this to be the driver for my approval. Now, when you go into workflow maintenance and look at the list of fields that are available, there are many, many fields available within the system. And so you'll have to kind of pick and choose which one makes the most sense for you in terms of your process and how you want to set that up. But note that all of the fields are really document specific in that there is no individual line item approval within the system. So it is really the document. So while you can have multiple approvers for a document in that there could be multiple line items that do have more than one approver, the approvers are going to see the whole document. They're going to see all the lines, even if those lines aren't necessarily related to them specifically. They would both still be required to approve them, but again, it doesn't isolate the lines that are specific to those individuals. So that's something to keep in mind right now, as that has not yet been developed by Microsoft. There has been some discussions that in future releases they may put that in as an option, but currently it is a full document approval, not necessarily individual line items. So once you sort of isolate what fields are required to create your conditions, and ours being a department, and we would have an amount that we would want to add in here in this case, so that it would be in excess of $1,000. Once I've completed those, I then need to assign somebody to the approval process. So who's the approver for this step? And this is basically tied to your company's Active Directory. So I can search for people that exist within your network. And what we mean by that is anybody who has sort of a login network account or an email with your organization typically has a domain or Active Directory account. So any of those people are searchable within the workflow, and they can be tied to your workflow as an approver. So I can assign then somebody from my organization to approve for this particular department. And then I need to set a time limit. So the time limit allows us to determine how much time do they have as a due date to actually complete the approval process. So you can select it in hours, days, weeks, whichever your preference is. And the system will use the workflow calendar to this, so that they're using working days as business days, as opposed to using sort of a 7-day-a-week calendar if that's not necessarily applicable to your organization. And then I can assign my email message for notification, so that when it's submitted, it auto-assigns an email. And you can, again, as I mentioned earlier, you can modify the email that's already there with some additional information, or you can create your own from scratch and select it there if you'd like. And finally, you want to include document attachments with your documents. So there's a checkbox that's available in your workflow that basically allows you to do that. And what that allows you to do is, as it's being routed for approval, any documents that are attached to the PO get routed with the email, so that anybody who wants to see those attachments as part of the approval process will have the ability to do that. Finally, there is a completion policy. You can have more than one approver assigned here, and as I mentioned, you could have multiple people approving different lines. But in this case, what they're referring to is that I may have more than one department head that could potentially approve for that department. So I can actually assign more than one approver. And in this case, we actually define whether or not we require all of those people to approve, a majority of them to approve, or really if only one of them has to approve, meaning that if I have 3 approvers assigned that they are available to approve and they have the rights to approve, and I select the option that only one is required to approve, then it's basically a first come, first served basis. So whoever opens up the PO and approves it first has basically completed the approval process, and the other two people no longer have to do anything with it. If I selected the majority have to approve, then 2 out of 3 of them will have to hit the approve button. And again, first come, first serve, so whichever first 2 out of the 3 get there and approve it, complete the process. And if I had selected all must approve, then all 3 of them are going to have to click the approve button before the PO can be considered approved and complete and processed for your vendor. So that's basically what's involved in creating the steps in your workflow. And you would continue to set up additional steps until all of your departments are set up and all of your conditions are built in. And if I had steps that had to follow another step, I can also set that up in my next step. So being here that with my second step where the value of the PO is greater than $10,000, that step is actually going to follow my first step because it means it's over 1,000, which means my department head has to approve it. But then if it's over 10,000, I have to get a second departmental approver on that. So it's going to follow that first step. So we know first step has to happen before it gets routed to our next department approver in the second step to move forward. But the remaining options in terms of all those other things remain the same. And so the last thing you want to do is once your actual workflow is created, you have to go in and activate it. Until it's activated, you won't be able to actually use it. The key to remember when you have multiple workflows, and this can happen as your process evolves over time, you can only have one active workflow per workflow type in GP. So I can't have multiple different PO workflows happening simultaneously activated in the system. The system can only read from one active workflow at a time. So if you need to change your process, the business is evolving, policies are changing, then what has to happen is you can create a new workflow, but you have to inactivate the other workflow. Once all of your documents have reached completed status, you can inactivate it and activate your new one so that the process moving forward is now your new process, not the old existing one. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're using workflow. Okay. So with that said, I think that sort of wraps up the discussion on what would happen at the PO setup side. I will turn to the panel to see if there are any specific questions regarding workflow. So there is a question specific to project. So there is project and expense, time and expense workflows available within GP. And again, the same rules apply. So the question is related to whether or not there is a multi-line approval component. Unfortunately, the system doesn't do the multi-line approval at this time. Now, as I mentioned, you can still create multiple lines in the document, and it will still route to the individual managers that are set up within your workflow for approval. It just means that all of those managers will see all of the document, not necessarily just the lines related to them. So the functionality still works in that both parties will still have to approve it in order for it to be completed, or various parties, but it doesn't isolate the information that's specific to them. So hopefully that will be something that comes down the line from Microsoft, but at this time it is a full document that will appear for approval. And then there's, I guess, a question about internal policy. So again, yeah, I mean, as we talked about earlier, when you're looking at your internal procurement policy, that's usually actually a very good start in terms of answering the questions as it relates to setting up your workflow. What makes logical sense as it relates to your organization's procurement policy and how you move forward. And again, if you have a very complex structure, automating it may be more difficult, because most of the time we've seen that complex structures or delegations of authority really have a lot of exceptions to the rules. And so you want to try and eliminate as much of the exceptions as possible. Otherwise, automating becomes really, really challenging. So I'd say take a look at your procurement policies, see if there's room for improvement. if there's opportunities to sort of simplify or streamline some of the processes or policies around that. And again, our team would be more than happy to help and assist with that in a requirements review and see how we can, what recommendations we could make to help simplify your procurement process so that it may fit into what GP has to offer in terms of workflow process. So I believe that's all the questions I have in the webinar panel. If you do think of anything else at all in terms of questions, by all means, feel free to send them our way. We're more than happy to assist you down the road if you think of anything else that you didn't think of today that you had questions about. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I sincerely apologize for the technical difficulties we had today. But I hope that the session still gave you at least a bit of an understanding of how you can set up and design at least your workflow outside with discussion before implementing in GP. You will receive a certificate this week for your professional credit hours. And also, if you haven't already, be sure to check out other upcoming Controllers Corner sessions on our website, crgroup.com/controllers-corner. And finally, a survey should appear after the webinar, so please take a moment to provide your feedback. So hopefully we can keep working to improve these sessions moving forward. So thank you again, and please feel free to reach out to anyone here at our team if we can assist you in getting more familiar with Dynamics GP systems and making it more efficient and effective moving forward. Thank you and have a wonderful day.